Hello everyone, my name is Sean Little and I'll be going over the paper titled Lock It and Still Lose It on the insecurity of automotive remote keyless entry systems. This paper was written by Flavio D. Garcia, David Oswald, Timo Kasper, and Pierre Pavlides. It was presented at the 25th Usenex Security Symposium from August 10th through 12th, 2016. Alright, now I'm going to go over a quick overview of this paper. So this paper set out to answer the question, how secure are modern remote keyless entry systems? I'm sure many of you watching this come from a cybersecurity background and have had this same question cross your mind. Even for those not in the cybersecurity profession, remote keyless entry systems are ubiquitous and affect us all. It is highly likely that you would not be able to buy a new car today without the vehicle coming with a remote keyless entry system in the form of a key fob. However, when buying a car, most consumers probably don't take the security of the key fob into consideration. This paper attempts to highlight just a few of the vulnerabilities that attackers can exploit in remote keyless entry systems. A primary motivation of this paper is to expose vulnerabilities in keyless entry systems commonly used by car manufacturers around the world in order to inform the security community of the risks involved with these systems. The authors are also attempting to help explain seemingly inexplainable vehicle theft or loss of items from within a vehicle when there is no physical evidence left behind at the crime scene. This is especially relevant for the insurance industry, as they have to have evidence of a crime in order to determine theft or whether or not this was insurance fraud. Exploiting a vulnerability in remote keyless entry systems could explain these types of situations, since such exploits don't leave behind any physical evidence. The final motivation for the authors is just the general curiosity of how secure our personal vehicles are. We surround ourselves with different electronic devices every day, and any one of them can serve as an attack vector for a dedicated adversary. Before we go further into the details of this paper, I want to cover some different components of a key. There are two main schemes involved with remote keyless entry into a vehicle. So the first one being remote keyless entry, RKE. This is the one that we will be talking about most often in this paper, and this is essentially a key fob where when you press a button, it initiates a cryptographic exchange between the key and the vehicle. The next scheme for remote entry into a vehicle is the passive keyless entry and start scheme. This is a bidirectional challenge and response scheme that only requires the key to be within a small physical distance of the vehicle. Early RKE and PKESs didn't involve any sort of encryption and were often vulnerable to replay attacks. PKESs are also especially vulnerable to physical threats, as an adversary only needs to wait for you to get close to the vehicle before being able to unlock it or attempt to turn it on and steal it. What both of these schemes have in common is that they both contain immobilizer transponders. Now these typically come in the form of an RFID transponder that contains a secret required to start the vehicle. Within the RKE scheme, the RKE and immobilizer systems are separate and use different RF frequencies. Here's just a diagram of a key utilizing the standard RKE scheme. As you can see, the immobilizer transponder and the remote keyless entry signals are being transmitted on different frequencies. As I mentioned previously, earlier versions of remote keyless entry systems were vulnerable to replay attacks. This is because an attacker only had to intercept and retransmit an authenticated signal to gain entry to a vehicle. The next evolution in security for remote keyless entry systems came with the adaptation of the rolling code system. This is a cryptographic solution that employs a cipher and a counter value that is increased on each button press. The counter value will then form the plain text for generating a new encrypted rolling code signal. When decrypted, the counter value is checked by comparing it to the last stored counter value that was recognized as valid. So an increased counter value is considered new and is accepted, while an old counter value would be considered invalid. So this helped to prevent replay attacks, as the attacker would then have to guess a counter value. However, as this paper proves, the way the rolling code system is currently implemented by modern manufacturers leaves several other vulnerabilities exposed to exploitation. In order to determine how secure remote keyless entry systems are, the researchers first had to understand what kind of encoding and encryption techniques remote keyless entry systems utilized. The researchers took a black box approach to the study and reverse engineered signals from different keys. They found that the majority of remote keyless entry systems use amplitude shift keying, while a small percentage employ frequency shift keying. Most remote keyless entry systems use either Manchester encoding or pulse width encoding. And keep in mind, the researchers tested keys from multiple different makes and models of vehicles. So now I'll actually get into the technical details of what's actually sent across the air when you press a button on your key fob. So the researchers referred to this as the rolling code data packet. So the rolling code data packet consists of a preamble, a fixed start pattern, a cryptographic data payload, and a final checksum. Of note, there is no fixed standard when it comes to sending this packet across the air. So many schemes deviate from this general structure in order to create a proprietary protocol. Also, in almost all cases, the same packet is sent multiple times, presumably to increase the reliability in receiving the packet in the event of environmental disturbances. To make note, the encrypted payload typically contains the unique identifier of the remote control, the rolling code counter value, and the button that was pressed, such as open the trunk, unlock the door, lock the door. Now obviously, when encrypting data, it must also be authenticated and then decrypted in order for it to be of any value. The research identified two primary routes for cryptographically authenticating the data sent by the remote. So the first one is implicit authentication. So for this, the complete payload is symmetrically encrypted. The receiver will then decrypt the packet and check if the content is valid, i.e. if the unique identifier is on a whitelist and the counter is in its validity window. So this method is seen with the Volkswagen group of remote keyless entry systems, which the researchers analyzed in several case studies. Explicit authentication is another form of authentication used by remote keyless entry systems. So for this, some form of message authentication code is computed over the data payload and then appended to the packet. An example of this approach is the HiTag2 cipher stream that is utilized in many different remote keyless entry systems implemented by different vehicle manufacturers. We'll discuss this further in the paper as the researchers dive into this in one of their case studies. The first case study discussed in this paper involves the Volkswagen Group. Keep in mind that the Volkswagen Group encompasses several different vehicle brands outside of Volkswagen, to include Audi, Bentley, and Skoda. This just goes to show how widespread that some of these vulnerabilities are. In this case study, 4 different remote keyless entry schemes were identified, with each having varying levels of security, typically from bad to worst. So the first scheme, noted as VW1, was used in the model years until approximately 2005. VW2 was implemented around 2004 and has been used onwards. VW3 came into the scene in 2006, and VW4 started being utilized in 2009. The first system we're going to dive into is the Volkswagen One System. This is the only Volkswagen Group scheme discussed in this paper that operates at 433.92 megahertz. So this is a fingerprint that might be able to help you identify who's using the scheme out in the wild. Initially, the data is transmitted in pulse width encoding form, and the first 4 bytes of the packet are XORed in order to obfuscate the packet. Additional obfuscation takes place However, in the spirit of responsible disclosure, those details were not published in this paper. At the end of the case study, the results determined that for this scheme, that security is based solely on obscurity. There is no cryptographic key involved in the computation of the rolling code, nor is there any attempt at key diversification. With only the knowledge of the details of the obfuscation function, an adversary can generate valid rolling codes to open and close vehicles by eavesdropping on only a single signal. Keep in mind that this scheme was used on cars up until about 2005, which means many of these vehicles are likely still on the road today, although they are getting kind of old. Moving on to slightly newer remote keyless entry systems, we have the VW2 and VW3 schemes. Both these schemes are nearly identical except for the cryptographic key used. These schemes both use the AUT64 cipher in order to encrypt the payload sent over the air. So far, this cipher has proven to be mathematically secure. However, the vulnerability comes from the fact that each respective scheme only has one fixed global master key, independent of vehicle or remote. It doesn't matter how fancy the lock on your front door is if someone else has a key to open it. The sole means of determining a valid rolling code is by whitelisting the UID and checking the counter value, both of which can be decrypted by an attacker possessing the master key. The master key for both schemes can also be extracted by examining the firmware within the remote. Therefore, the vulnerability with these schemes comes from a lack of key diversity. As an added fact, a single global key per scheme means that any vehicle using these schemes will decrypt the payload of all rolling codes received within the same key in the vicinity. Finally, to the most recent Volkswagen Group remote keyless entry scheme identified in this paper, VW4. This scheme was first introduced to consumers in 2009. Surprisingly, this scheme has the same structure as VW3, except it uses the XT cipher to decrypt the packet, and the scheme suffers from the same vulnerability by only using a single worldwide key. The researchers found this scheme implemented in a 2016 Audi Q3. The conclusion from this case study is that while the cryptographic algorithms have improved over the years, vulnerabilities are still present due to a lack of key distribution that has not been properly solved in the studied schemes. However, the researchers of this paper did bring their findings to the affected parties before publishing, and according to Volkswagen Group, this problem has been addressed in the latest generation of vehicles, where individual cryptographic keys are used. For those of us stuck with the older Volkswagen Group schemes, how do we solve this issue? Well, the solutions identified by the researchers paint a grim picture. The first solution is obviously to update the firmware on the remotes to incorporate key diversity, therefore increasing security. However, this presents its own challenges, due to the fact that the code used to run the remote keyless entry system is written in read-only memory at production on the microprocessor within the remote. This would mean massive and expensive recalls of all affected remote keyless entry systems in order to replace the keys for all users. The second identified solution is to not use the remote keyless entry functionality at all, and instead rely on the mechanical parts of the key. Since neither of these solutions are practical, the researchers provided some advice on how to protect yourself if you possess a vulnerable device. First, don't rely on the typical visual and auditory signals that indicate your vehicle is locked. An attacker could easily jam the lock signal from your remote and send their own signal to flash the lights and honk the horn. Physically check that the car is locked. If you notice that when pressing the lock button, your vehicle does not respond, this could be an indicator that your device is being jammed and an attacker is attempting to eavesdrop on the rolling codes. As a note, there is currently no evidence left behind for a remote keyless entry attack. Finally, and this should go without saying, don't store valuables in your car expecting them to be secure. These valuables are at risk of being stolen through either an RKE attack or someone physically breaking into your vehicle. Moving on to the second case study, the researchers examined remote keyless entry systems that utilize the HiTag2 scheme. This is a rolling code scheme that implements the HiTag2 stream cipher in order to encrypt the payload. This scheme is produced by NXP, a company known for producing semiconductors, and it is not specific to any single brand of vehicle. This scheme does have key diversity. However, the vulnerability lies in the fact that the HiTag2 cipher was cryptographically broken in 2012, and is therefore vulnerable to correlation attacks in which the attacker can uncover the key and decrypt the payload in order to produce their own valid rolling codes. Here we are going to dive into how an attacker will conduct this correlation attack to exploit the high tag 2 scheme and show just how easy it is to decrypt a payload. In order for a successful attack, the attacker needs to identify the counter, UID, and command sent by the remote. For the counter, 10 of the 28 bits in the counter are sent over the air. The attacker only has to guess the remaining 18 bits. For a successful correlation attack, the attacker only has to eavesdrop on 4 valid rolling codes, meaning presses of the key. Once all this is put together, recovering the cryptographic key only takes about a minute of computation on a standard laptop. With a 48-bit high tag 2 cipher stream, the adversary first guesses a 16-bit window corresponding to the linear feedback stream bits 32 through 42. This, plus the UID, gives the adversary a complete stream. The adversary is then able to compute the correct key stream through a series of bit shifts and XOR operations. This only requires about 400,000 guesses, which on a modern computer can take only about a minute. So, in conclusion, while the high tag 2 scheme doesn't suffer from the same lack of key diversity as the Volkswagen Group schemes, its vulnerability lies with the implementation of a cryptographically weak cipher that can easily be broken by a determined attacker. The researchers identified vulnerable high tag 2 schemes on vehicles manufactured by Alfa Romeo, Chevy, Fiat, Ford, Nissan, and Renault, to name a few popular vehicle brands. The answer to the initial research question of how secure are modern remote keyless entry systems is not very secure. It is obvious in the paper that major manufacturers have used insecure remote keyless entry schemes for over 20 years. The paper demonstrates ways to clone the remote control for both the Volkswagen Group and high tag 2 rolling code schemes after eavesdropping on only a few rolling codes while using off-the-shelf products. Of note, other schemes were analyzed with similar vulnerabilities uncovered, but these schemes were not published in this paper to adhere to responsible disclosure practices. The researchers also did bring all their findings to all the remote keyless entry manufacturers analyzed in order to patch these vulnerabilities. It is unclear whether the remote keyless entry vulnerabilities described in this paper are currently exploited by criminals in the wild. However, there have been various media reports about unexplained theft from locked vehicles over the past few years. The security issues described in this paper could explain such incidents. Owners of affected vehicles should be aware that unlocking the doors to their vehicles is much simpler for criminals than previously assumed. Therefore, don't assume belongings locked in a vehicle are safe. Previous recommendations such as ensure the lights blink and the car makes a sound, or lock it or lose it, are no longer accurate. Attacks on remote keyless entry systems can occur from relatively long distances away, enabling an attacker to eavesdrop on an entire parking lot. As improvements in radio frequency technology increase, so will the distance that an attacker can conduct a successful remote keyless entry exploitation. Additionally, attacks exploiting remote keyless entry vulnerabilities leave no trace. Insurance companies will have to identify new means of determining vehicle and property theft and distinguishing it from insurance fraud. Keeping in mind that this paper was first published in 2016, I wanted to present a few follow-up questions to prompt further discussion amongst researchers. First, how have modern car manufacturers reacted to news of this vulnerability disclosure? The researchers mentioned that they did notify Volkswagen Group and NXP in 2015 and 2016, respectively, about the vulnerabilities. Volkswagen Group reportedly acknowledged the vulnerabilities and have since implemented remote keyless entry schemes with diverse key generation, solving the vulnerability discussed in this paper. NXP has also shifted to AES-based remote keyless entry systems that are not affected by the vulnerabilities discussed in this paper, being the weak cryptographic cipher. It would be interesting to conduct this study again and see what other improvements have been made and what vulnerabilities still exist. Next, has there been evidence of criminals exploiting these vulnerabilities in the wild since this paper was published? While for an experienced cybersecurity researcher, these techniques are relatively simple to utilize, it still requires an in-depth technical knowledge and training in order to successfully carry out an attack. Is there any current evidence of these attacks being carried out successfully? And as a follow-up to the previous question, can devices to exploit these remote keyless entry system vulnerabilities be mass-produced? How much of a threat is this to modern remote keyless entry systems? The researchers used off-the-shelf products in order to exploit the vulnerabilities described in the paper. Hypothetically, a criminal could do the same. And with those final questions, that sums up my discussion of the paper, Lock It and Still Lose It, on the insecurity of automated remote keyless systems. Thank you for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.